Welcome back. We move from the old world to the new world in the Americas. We'll start off with Anglo-America, and I'll get to this in a second, but Anglo-America is just simply in reference to the English influences on the culture we see today. Not that it's exclusive, it's just the dominant influence. And really, we're only dealing with two countries here, just the United States and Canada. And that British colonial influence is why we speak English. It's why, let me rephrase that. It's why English is the dominant language. It's the common language of the country. Our legal system is based on English common law. Some of our farming traditions are English traditions. Our food traditions are English traditions. So we have all of this cultural influence from the British because they had settled a large part of the eastern United States, what becomes the United States, and they were also the foundation of the government that we see today. Now, obviously, the Spanish were here, the French were here, and there was an indigenous population here as well. But the government and the culture that becomes the United States of America was established through the British cultural tradition. They weren't the biggest migrants here, they just were the first. And so anytime anybody came into and migrated into the United States, they were kind of surrounded and enveloped by this cultural traditions and would adopt it. And so even though, for example, my family came from Germany in the 1800s, we have very little influence from that family migration that we can see today. And then it's 100% on my mom's side German because they all kind of married people that they knew where they migrated to in upstate New York. And so all of her lineage you can trace back to Germany exclusively. But there are no German-speaking people in the family, and they migrated just 140 years ago. And the only thing that we have in the house that's Germanic specifically is a cuckoo clock. And that's just something weird that was always in anybody's family. We knew they had a cuckoo clock, but that's it. So the British were the initial ones, but then we start to see the influence of the Industrial Revolution. And so the British industrialized first. So we've had the first wave of migrants coming from England. Then we had the second wave continuing from the British Isles as they industrialized first, but that dropped off and kind of got taken over by some of the German and Scandinavian migration waves later as those areas industrialized. We had some individual pushes going on like the 1840s where the Irish potato famine, where the British were really cruel to the Irish, and we had half the population either died or fled the country. So as Europe industrializes and they move into that third stage of the demographic transition and see huge population pressures, that's when we see a lot of migrants to the Americas. Now notice this big drop-off. Well, what's happening is Europe goes into World War, the recession hits, so some of the push factors to come to the United States drop off, and the pull factors, because we were in the recession this time, drop off as well. Well, as our economy increases, Europe doesn't have the population pressures anymore, but Asia and Latin America do. And so their push factors in Asia and Latin America and our economic growth kind of drew a new wave of migrants in. So one of the things about the Americas that is fascinating to me is how wealthy we are and why that's important, because wealth kind of translates into power in the world today. And nobody's ever going to worry about Andorra, that tiny country between Spain and France, ever taking over the world simply because they're so small and have a small economy. So what is it about the United States and Canada that makes us such a world economic leader? So I'll go through these one at a time, and we're kind of leading up to some of the factors that work in our favor. And we can compare this later with China, with Japan, and some other countries that share some of these things, but not all. And arguably, who is the next global superpower? Will it be China? Will it remain being the United States? So we're big. The United States and Canada cover a huge area, just like with Russia, has a lot of minerals and opportunities over a large area. So do the United States and Canada. We benefit because we're a slightly lower latitude, so we've got better growing conditions for food, but we also have some of those ancient mineral sites like that you would find in the northern portions of Eurasia, we find in the northern portions of Canada. So when you have a large area with lots of good areas to grow food, you can support large populations. So we don't really struggle with food production like African countries do or South Asian countries do, where they don't have ample amounts of arable land you can farm. So not only are we big, it's one of the oldest rocks on Earth can be found in the Canadian Shield. And so through the era, through plate tectonics, other rocks were accreted onto North America, and we had multiple physiographic regions that reflect Earth's history. So different things going on in those periods of time meant that we have minerals that were created during that period of time. The easiest example is the rocks that were laid down that become the Appalachian Mountains. Those were laid down in a period of time where there was dense tropical forests and swamplands, and so there was a lot of vegetation that got buried, and those become our layers of coal. We're also not really torn apart by separatist movements. Now, I'm not just saying that there aren't issues related to the different ethnic groups within the United States where there are conflicts, but I'm talking about full-scale war where you've got Texas fighting with the United States in a war so they can separate and become their own country. That's not happening. And so the separatist movements that we see in Europe aren't happening in the United States. We had one, and that was 180 years ago. So we moved on from that, most of us have moved on from that. And then the Quebecois in Canada, theirs is a little more recent. And when we talk about Canada, I'll talk about the Quebec separatist movement, which did start off violent at first, but now it's become kind of a political issue, and it's since has calmed down a lot. Now, even though we do get along with each other, it's not to say we don't have significant minority populations. The minority groups within the United States, obviously they vary from region to region, where you're going to have areas where the minority population is the majority of the population, and vice versa. It's always interesting to travel to different parts of the United States to really see how ethnically diverse we are. We're in California. We're really a melting pot in California. We have a little bit of everything here. Spatially, as you'd expect, your Hispanic population is going to be near Latin America to the south, and the Cuban population here, and you've got Puerto Rican populations in large cities, though most of that was during the economic growth of the 1940s and 50s. Now, obviously, they were here first, the Native Americans, and they would have covered all of this prior to 1491, but the kind of chased out of the good farmland in this area, given land that was really nobody else knew how to farm it or what to do with it. And so notice, this is desert, this is desert, this is barely farmable land in some of these remote areas. So the indigenous population for the Native Americans is kind of a function of what happened in their first few hundred years of interactions with Europeans. The black population dominated down here because this is where most of the plantations and slave trade in your population was concentrated early on. We still see majority of the black population here. It's not to say they're not in other areas, primarily in urban areas where there were ample job opportunities. The Asian population, obviously West Coast, we have a lot of ties to the Pacific Rim countries. We've had Japanese and Chinese migrants into the United States all the way back into the the mid 1800s. And they're going to come in through the coastal ports in this area. Then we have more recent migrations, such as the Vietnamese, where we end up with pockets of Vietnamese in other parts of the country as well. All right, so Oh, daughter's at the door. Hold on. Not only are we a big country with lots of opportunities, we have so many different minerals in the United States and Canada. We were able to industrialize quite easily because the easy access we had to iron and coal in the 1800s. Canada has just as much diversity as we do, and then we'll see later that this mineral wealth spreads down into Mexico as well. We have almost everything except for tin and bauxite. There's some bauxite in Canada, but not enough to meet our needs. Bauxite is used to make aluminum. And the reason I bring up bauxite specifically is later when we get to Latin America, I'm going to talk about how the United States not having bauxite led to the Jonestown Massacre. Just a little teaser for you to want to listen to the Latin America lecture. You can see, yeah, you should memorize all these numbers, by the way, so I'm just kidding. So we're a big country. We have lots of mineral resources. We seem to get along with each other. We also have a large population base. And it's not just that we have a lot of people, because obviously India and China with over 1 billion people each should have a large economy, but our large population has money to spend. I'm sure almost all of you have your own cell phone. You probably have a television in your room. You have access to an automobile. All of those are material goods that, as long as we're purchasing them, drives the economy and keeps the economy going strong. So let me see what's in my wallet right now, because of course this is a visual thing that you can't see at the moment. And I've got cash in here of 20, 30, about $50 in cash. Which is about the annual wages of about the third of the population in India, and I just have in cash in my wallet. So one of the things we're seeing with the restrictions put in place in 2020 because of the COVID virus is that our economy dropped so quickly because people simply weren't spending money. If they don't go out, they don't spend money, and the economy grinds to a halt. So the retail aspect of our society really drives our economy. We're also, as workers, we're highly efficient. We're used to be for decades the most efficient. However, other economies have passed us up. That's not a bad thing. It's just that we can produce more goods at a higher quality and a higher rate per person than many other economies can. A good comparison is my father-in-law works for a computer programming company, and they tried to outsource some of the work to India, but it came back with so many problems and bugs that they ended up spending more time and money fixing the problems than if they had just spent it on the higher wages for the American workers. So even though they were cheaper labor costs overseas, they weren't efficient enough to be worth the savings. So we're seeing kind of the high-tech specialized jobs stay here, and then some of the lower skill work being shipped off to China and Mexico and other places. But we're still pretty good at what we manufacture. Now, not only do we get along internally, we get along with each other. So the United States, Canada, and Mexico, it says an undefended border. I'm talking about we don't have a military presence there with tanks ready to invade Canada at a moment's notice. So the fact that we don't have to worry militarily about our two neighbors either invading us or us invading them, it does not divert from our economy. And because we trade with each other so much, we're all each other's largest trading partners, it really drives each other's economy. Now, NAFTA, or should I correct it to the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, this really opens up trade between the three countries. And we hit a little hiccup along the road with how our current administration gets along with the governments of Mexico and Canada, but we still are benefiting from the presence of this open trade between us. Now this picture down here, this is an older one. This is pre 9/11, when you really could just saunter into Canada. When I went to Canada, it was not too long before this. I drove across the bridge from Detroit into Canada. Nobody stopped me. Nobody said anything. I just basically, drove across the bridge and I was in another country. It wasn't until I came back to the United States, some guy kind of leans into my window, go, "Where are you coming from?" And I said, "California." He goes, "Okay." And he just waved me through. All right, so let's move on to Canada, and we'll break Canada down into subregions. And Justin Trudeau is their current prime minister, and he's probably the most popular prime minister in the United States. I know what I just said. He's the most well-known prime minister in the United States of Canada. Usually, my students can never name the prime minister of Canada, but Justin Trudeau seems to be in the media more often. He's made himself more approachable than previous prime ministers. It's something that the people can relate to, and so he's become more of a media presence. Normally, nobody can name who the prime minister of Canada is, which is strange for our largest trading partner, our friendly neighbors to the north, and then nobody can remember their name. Usually nobody can name all the provinces either. The population of Canada, half the population lives within 80 miles of the United States. They mostly for climate reasons, but also economic ties. There's a lot of north-south trade between Canada and the United States, so there's more goods moving from Ontario into New England than there is from the Atlantic provinces moving to British Columbia. So we see a lot of north-south movement of goods. The first region we'll deal with will be the Atlantic provinces. And, nope, I got ahead of myself. So the economic relationship between Canada and the United States, one of the ways to see that is through the automobile industry. Because the nature of how automobiles are built and assembled now, you'll see one area that makes the engines, another area makes the frames, another factory will put those pieces together. So we'll see like an amalgam of different goods coming from Canada, United States, and Mexico, and sometimes literally the car parts moving back and forth, I'm exaggerating, where the engine goes to Canada to be put in a frame, and then the frame comes to the United States to have the body put on it. It's not quite that extreme, but we see those parts moving back and forth across the border. And the final assembly of a lot of what we think of as American cars, the final assembly is in Canada. And Camaros used to be made in Canada, and so the Cadillac, the quintessential big American luxury car, is assembled in Canada. All right, now I can get to the maritime provinces. Now, typically, when discussing these provinces, most of the time, unless you're from this area, people tend to lump them all together because they have similar characteristics. They're relatively small population bases. They're relatively small in size compared with the other provinces. And when the British first started taking over this territory from the French, one of the reasons they wanted this area was they wanted access to the fishing grounds in the North Atlantic. And so the fishing tradition here goes back to the French and then the British settlement subsequently. The fishing tradition, though, that's long gone, simply because the fishing industry in the North Atlantic has collapsed. And so now, because of the economy that was based on fishing isn't there anymore, these areas are very dependent on government aid, and there's some resentment from the rest of Canada that they have to spend so much on these small provinces. The tourism industry has been booming because those little fishing villages now become quaint little fishing villages, and people set up bed and breakfast. So we're seeing a lot of traffic from the rest of Canada and the east coast of the United States vacationing up in this area. If you go, it used to be Maine was a big tourist destination for some of those coastal cities, but it's become so commercialized that it doesn't have that quaint feel to it anymore, and that's kind of shifted into the maritime provinces. Other than that, politically, not really much of an influence in Canada. Where the influence is the core, and it's in two provinces. It's in Quebec and in Ontario. And what's strange about the two provinces is they're so different from each other, and yet here's where half the population lives. Most of the economic headquarters, business center is in this area. The capital is in this area. So this is the center of power for Canada, is Quebec and Ontario. However, Quebec is predominantly French-speaking. Ontario is predominantly English speaking. And so I'll get to some of those cultural differences and how they occurred. So with Quebec, this is the remnants of the French settlement in North America. Oop, I need to back up to show you the graphic of what happened. So this area was French. And so when the British took it over for the fishing, they got these. And so a lot of the French that lived here kind of moved to the south or into Quebec. And the ones that moved to the south ended up in and around the New Orleans area. So that's where some of that French cultural tradition begins. But the English, when they were settling their land in this area, they didn't push out the French Canadians who lived here. They just simply skipped over them. So the British settlement kind of started here and worked its way to the west by skipping over Quebec. So this is why we have a remnant of French Canadians here, but not strong French Canadian populations in other areas. So French Canadian is not the same thing as French. They speak French, but they've been separated from Canada for 250 years or more, or they've been separated from France for 250 years or more. And so we're seeing that the French-Canadian cultural traditions are very different. Although they're still, using the language, and you'll see some of the colors, the use of the French blue, the fleur-de-lis that you see here are often symbolic of it. So the separatist movement began in the 1960s. Remember the 1960s, not that you would remember, or me, but in the 1960s we had lots of civil rights and human rights movements around the world. And here it was a recognition of the French-Canadian culture. They saw it as being deteriorated and being watered down by the Anglo culture in the rest of Canada. And so they sought to protect their cultural identity first by wanting to become a separate nation. Now, it was violent at first. There were bombings, but it later just turned into a political movement that kind of climaxed in the 1990s and kind of has died down since then. Quebec, the major city in Quebec is Montreal. This used to be one of the biggest cities in Canada. But with the separatist movement, what we saw was most of the businesses that were in Canada relocated to Toronto, and Montreal went through a period of decline and now has become a major city again, but its economic and political focus is on the rest of Quebec, where Toronto serves the entire country. So we see a shift in the major cities. So the French language is the sole language of the province. One of the things that the Canadian government was able to do to kind of keep Quebec within Canada was to have concessions, where they could have more decision-making locally. They had more power locally, and we'll see that other provinces got stuff too. But for French, one of their big things that they got was that the sole language in Quebec is French. It's the official language of the province. The rest of the country is bilingual, where everything has to be in French and in English. But in Quebec, it's French only. So that's why you have PFK, which is Poulet Free Kentucky. And my French is really bad, so I apologize. The stop signs are in French. This guy had a bagel store that was called Real Bagel. I said, no, you have to change the name. And he refused to. So he found like 4 French words or 3 French words, R-E and A. I don't even know what they were. But he had to abbreviate it because it wouldn't fit on his sign. So that's why it's an abbreviation of what the official name of this store is, but it still ended up being Real Bagel. And of course, some differences in food preferences. Poutine, which is cheese curds. One of my friends from Canada loves it, and he keeps trying to serve it to me, and I keep trying it. I'm trying to be a good American and try new food type, but it's just got this odd sour taste that I can't get past. I do like the brown gravy. And they use a lot of brown gravy. So in 95, when they had a referendum, it was a vote on should they separate or not. It barely didn't pass. It was a 0.5 percentage point difference between the yes and the no. And so it ended up that they would remain in Canada, because in 1995, we could have had 2 countries to the north of us, Quebec and Canada. Now we have 1. The thought was, oh my gosh, the next referendum is just going to pass quickly, because what happened was the French Canadians who lived in other parts of Canada moved back into Quebec, and then the non-French Canadians, a lot of them moved out of Quebec. Not everybody, but we had a kind of shift in population demographics. So Quebec became even more French Canadian. But they got so many concessions that their French Canadian culture was so concentrated and kind of being well served, the issues were no longer there. So they haven't brought it up again, and now it's not really an issue as a separatist movement politically. There's still a few hardcore people, but there's no bombings and there's no even motion to have a referendum for them to split off. Personally, when I visit Canada, I enjoy going to Quebec because it's so different than the United States and Canada, because you're in this weird, like, you see some of the American and Canadian cultural traditions, but at the same time, everybody's speaking French. The food's a little bit different. It's kind of fun, and it's not that expensive. During the separatist period, and this still is true today, that people, if you're wearing blue, you're pro-Quebec, and if you're wearing red, you're pro-Canadian. I don't know what these two guys are doing in the photo, but you'll notice the sea of blue and looking for sovereignty. Now, one of the fun things about Canada is that their hockey team names still reflect local geography. And in the United States, we've gotten away from that a lot, or the origins of the name are lost. For example, the Los Angeles Lakers got their name because that team originated in Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes. The Dodgers, who originally were in Brooklyn, they were the nickname for the Trolley Dodgers, because the trolley's in Brooklyn and people would have to jump out of the way, so Trolley Dodgers. So you end up with nicknames that kind of don't have the same meaning, or a lot of new teams have gone to generic names so that as to not to offend anybody, or they just kind of pick the Raptors, which I have yet to understand why they named a team after dinosaurs, but I'm going to let that go. So the Nordiques, you don't get a much more French Canadian name than that. Look at that. It's a French word. They've got the fleur-de-lis, it's in French blue. That's very, very French Canadian. Unfortunately, the franchise was sold and became the Colorado Avalanche. The other Quebec hockey team, the Canadiens, notice it has the French spelling of Canadian. It's also, their nickname is the Habs, which is, their official name is Les Habitants de Canada, something like that. But the Habs is a nickname. That's why you have the H in the middle of the C right there. The Habs is a nickname. You can read it there, but it's in reference to the habitants, the nickname for the Habs, for the farmers in that area. Now, I'll talk more about this later when I talk about survey methods in the United States, because this exists there as well. But the long lot system is a French land survey system. It's a French tradition of how land is divided, and the idea is that if your major transportation route is a stream or a road, everybody's house is along that transportation route. Notice they're all here along the stream, and then your farmland goes away from that. So by having this kind of land distribution, you've got your home with water access, you've got this floodplain, which is your good farmland, and as you go up into the hills, you get some forested area or some pasture area. So everybody has equal access to all of the things that you need: farmland, forest, and pasture land. Whereas if this was one person's farm, what about the person's farm is over here? They wouldn't have the same access to transportation. Ontario, this is the more Anglo British Canada, and here the cultural traditions change, where you got more British colonial or British influence in it. You can see the bearskin caps, the red jackets, very similar to what you would see in England. The capital is in Ontario, but the city is Ottawa, and it's towards the Quebec border, kind of a concession, like, well, we'll kind of put it in the middle, but it's still in Ontario, the more British aspect of it. And even the hockey team in Ottawa reflects the local geography, because if that's where the capital is, the hockey team name there is the Senators. So having the Senators makes sense if that's where your government is. Toronto is the big city here. This one really boomed after Montreal went into decline in the 1970s. This is the financial center of Canada. It's their New York City as far as economic activity. It's nothing against Toronto, but it's not really an exciting city to visit. It's more of a functional city. All right, so let's move to the west, the prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Here, this is your main farming area, and it makes sense because you've got the you've got the same extension of the Great Plains. They don't stop at the United States-Canada border; they extend into southern Canada. So just as that part of the United States is a big food-growing area, this is too. I'm just pointing out winter wheat because I find it fascinating. You plant winter wheat right before winter comes. Normally, you don't plant crops before winter, but why you do it is they stay dormant through the wintertime, but when the snow melts, that waters and germinates the seeds, and so they're immediately ready to grow. So if you have a shorter growing season, this increases your output. This is also where you find oil reserves. So they've got liquid petroleum, but also they've got tar sands and oil shales. That's the big boom in industries right now. And we have the same thing in this part of the United States as well. And tar sands and oil shales are when you have solid rock that doesn't have liquid oil in it. It's part of the rock itself. And so in order to get the oil out of the rock, you have to break up the rock, crush it, cook it, and then you can get the oil to flow away from it. It's a little bit more expensive to produce, but when oil prices are so high, it makes economic sense to do so. Now the oil is reflected in the hockey team names here too. So in Edmonton in Alberta, they're the Edmonton Oilers. And then Calgary also in Alberta, the Calgary Flames. And that's in reference to the oil refineries. You always have a big flame blowing or going to blow off any excess gases that might be leaking. So that a perfect reflection of what the dominant industry in those areas are. Now back to Quebec getting their concessions to be a single language. Alberta and the other provinces, they got concessions too, because they weren't just going to give away everything to Quebec without getting stuff themselves. So one of the things that the prairie provinces, especially Alberta, wanted was the control of the oil industry. That it would be a provincial control and provincial licensing as opposed to federal licensing, and they were granted that. And so that brought a lot of money into Alberta. And so Alberta has, as a province, is unusually rich simply because that money isn't going to the central Canadian government, it's going to the provincial government of Alberta. British Columbia will do the same thing with their lumber resources. But those were the other concessions that were going on, that why Alberta would go along with Quebec getting it is because they got something out of the deal too. So I'd mentioned this before when we were comparing United States and Russia, if they were unitary or federal. And I mentioned Canada was even more federal than we were. This is an example of that, where mineral resources in the United States are still controlled by the federal government. We have the Bureau of Land Management, where here the provincial governments have taken over a lot of that. Oh, look, the cute little fox that they're destroying with pipelines and digging, but that's a different issue. So in Winnipeg, Manitoba, there is a air base there. And it's a military air base used by both the United States and Canada. And so their hockey team reflected that in the Winnipeg Jets. And so that's where they got their name from. Well, the Winnipeg Jets, the franchise was sold and went to the United States, but they got a new franchise recently. And the big question was, well, what's Winnipeg going to call their hockey team? Are they going to go back to the Jets because, it's a military name? It might offend some people. Are they going to go with something generic? And they went all in and became the Winnipeg Jets again. And instead of using a generic, this could be just a normal airplane carrying passengers jet, they went all in with we're going to go with the military jets. And so their logo for the Winnipeg Jets reflects the Canadian military logos. The Vancouver on the far western edge, this is also unlike the rest of Canada just simply because they have so many economic ties to California, the west coast of the United States, and the Pacific Rim. So the major port in Vancouver brings in a lot of money to the rest of British Columbia. And so those concessions that everybody was getting, this was one of the ones where the port activities and the resources in British Columbia stay within it. Now, there's only one big city. There are It's too forested and mountainous to the north, so most of the population is in that far, far southern end of British Columbia. The team name here is Canucks. This is one that's probably not going to resonate. Canuck is a nickname for a Canadian, but you'd never call somebody from Quebec a Canuck. So it's kind of reflective of the Anglo-Canadian, not the French-Canadian. A little more obtuse. So lots of influence from the Asian migration into the area, especially after Hong Kong was going to be turned back over to the Chinese in the 1990s, as we really saw a huge outflux of Hong Kong residents to to Vancouver. And those who could afford two homes often kept their home in Hong Kong to make sure that maybe things will get better, which it didn't. Or they could have a residence in Canada. Lumber, this is one of their big exports from the area. The growing conditions are great. The coastal areas can grow timber and be harvested year round. You get the interior, you've got winter set in, but for the most part, this is one of the big lumber producing regions of the world. Chances are your home was probably built with Canadian lumber. The paper you're writing your notes on right now was probably from Canadian wood pulp. The last province we'll talk about is Nunavut. And Nunavut is the Inuit. We don't use the term Eskimo. It's considered derogatory. They carved out a portion of the Northwest Territories and a part of Quebec and allowed the Inuit population to self-rule. So we have pretty much tribal rule in this area. It's taking it one step further than what we have on our Indian reservations, where here the government really steps out, and the only time they come in is if there's been a murder or they've been violating some of the trade agreements. Like they're allowed to hunt whales and seal, but they can't sell any of that for profit. It can only be for local use. And so in recent years, one of the groups was selling ivory, and then the government had to step in to stop it. And so you all can speak Cree and know that that says stop. All right, in part 2, we'll do the United States.